Subscribe or they will haunt you.
What is the scariest thing that has happened to you in near the woods? I'll start. When I was 13-14 years old, I was invited to a birthday party of a close friend of mine down the street. There were a dozen of us or something around that, as he had invited close personal friends and a couple of classmates. Inside his basement living room, alternating turns on who gets to play Super Smash Melee on the GameCube. As the hours passed, the sweaty gaming by a dozen or so sweaty young teenagers was slowly but surely increasing the temperature of the room, as there was only a single window that was poorly circulating the air inside. We decided to head out for a quick breather to cool down and let the air in the room renew. The story takes place in Norway, a country not particularly known for its high criminality rates and psycho murders. Besides the 2011 shootings that happened many years after I was done being a sweaty teenager. So parents tend to be quite fine with letting children and teenagers out into the dark for short periods of time. This is where the wood gets relevant. Behind my house, there was a forest. Now, forests aren't particularly rare at all, and besides stories of trolls and monsters, there wasn't all that much to be afraid of. The house and the forest was separated by a road, a single street light illuminating the pavement sidewalk closest to the house. We were all gathered outside the back of the house getting some fresh air as one of us spot two reflective lights looking sort of like eyes. After 5 minutes of back and forth speculating as to what it might be and daring each other to go investigate, I rationally thought that it most likely was glass or something of the sort, simply reflecting the dimly lit street light. I walked away from the group, making my way towards the two eyes 30 or something meters away. I came to the source and realized it was simply a sheet of clear plastic, picked it up, turned around and announced what it was. That's when something happened. My friends started yelling loudly. Some started running towards the house. As the sheep of a teenager I was, and in my bewildered situation, I ran towards them as I didn't want to be left behind. I got into the hallway of the house where all the others had gathered, as well as my friends' parents, and saw that some of the others were crying. Unclear as to what just happened, I, of course, asked what was going on. What had disturbed everyone so much to the point of tears, something that teenage males are not particularly fond of doing in front of other male friends. Heaving for breath, the birthday kid told me that in the instance where I had turned around, a man, presumably in his mid-40s according to some of the others, had suddenly appeared behind me with his arms reached out in a choking hold. According to the ones that were the last to run back indoors who witnessed when I started to run, he had been inches away by the time I started sprinting back. The police weren't called, as, well, this was a group of teenagers claiming to have seen a man presumably ready to choke me at 22 o'clock on a Saturday night, and nothing actually happened. However, I do think back and wonder, was I about to be kidnapped? Was he simply just going to strangle me to death in front of my friends? Or was it merely an act of collective imagination getting out of hand after having previously been spooked by reflective plastic? Since I live in the National Forest, work at a summer camp, and go camping often, I have a few creepy stories. However, this one stands out because I was at a family friend wedding yesterday and this story was brought up. This took place in a camping area near Palomar Mountain in Southern California. I was about 5 years old, and while I don't recall the actual incident, I do vaguely remember the camping trip itself. My family and I were there with an extended group of family friends. One night, my dad, along with some of the other dads and the older kids, went on a night hike, leaving my mom alone at the tent with me. It was fairly late and my mom had gotten me to sleep, so she was trying to get to sleep herself. Only, she kept being woken up by this scraping sound outside the tent. She started to freak out because she was all alone with a small child in the middle of the forest at night. Then she saw the shadow of the hand on the outside of the tent. This was when my mom let out a blood-curdling scream. All the friends that had been on the hike heard it from a distance and came rushing back to the campsite. They started asking her what happened happened and she tells them. After hearing that someone may have been trying to break into the tent, everyone went searching for anything suspicious around the camp, and what did they find? Dozens of little eyes reflecting in their flashlights. As it turns out, it was a psycho killer that tried to break into the tent that night. It was a curious raccoon. My mom thinks the raccoon hand only looked huge because it was magnified by the moonlight from outside. I was camping with about 5 of my friends. We set up in the same forest as we would usually and just sat around talking with our flashlights on. One of my friends, I'll call him Kevin, said he quickly needed to go to the gas station. It was quite close to where we set up, so it wasn't that out of the ordinary. Once he had left, after around 2-3 minutes, I started hearing a quiet high-pitched voice saying "come here" from where Kevin had left. When I asked my friends about it, they said it was most likely Kevin, as his voice wasn't that deep either. But the voice kept getting deeper. Every time it would say "come here," it would sound slowed down, like if you slowed down a YouTube video. Eventually one of my other friends, let's call him John, stood up to go check out what it was. Then Kevin came up behind us carrying a couple snacks and drinks. When John turned around and saw Kevin, the voice in an extraordinarily deep pitch said "come here." It wasn't Kevin because he was right behind us. So who was it? That was it. We all started booking it for the gas station. We then heard the voice coming closer and leaves crunching behind us. Once we got to the station, we told the cashier to lock the doors. He was reluctant at first, but when he saw a dark figure rushing towards us, he happily obliged. We got some other friends to pick us up, and let's say we never went back to that forest. Okay, so I used to live in rural Michigan, and my cousin and I, we were best friends at the time, decided to explore the forest behind his house, and we heard gunshots. Now that was normal. People would hunt there. But what was and normal were the bullets landing at our feet, and we both are like, what the fuck? And we sprint behind trees, and the bullets stop. We decide to investigate where they came from, and we find an old locked hunting shed. But the thing is that we had been in this part of the woods and have never seen it before, and the lock was rusted to the lock, so I could and even move it. My cousin and I looked at each other, and I grabbed a log and broke the lock with one hit. I was 90 pounds. That's how weak and rusted the lock was. And the only thing inside of the shed was a pristine condition tool drill and a hunting rifle that looked like it had been there since the 1930s. And that it, to this day, 6 years later, we still think that someone had disturbed a dead guy's old favorite hunting spot, and the ghost was angry and started shooting at us. Decide to investigate. Wrong. This is where you nope the hell out of there. So I was around 11-12 and used to spend most days and evenings after school in the forest mountain biking with some friends. It was a time when we had extremely hot summers and near daylight at 9 p.m. So naturally we'd stay super late in session on the downhill trails. I lived the furthest away out of all of us at the time, about 6 miles, and would stay late and do some extra runs, as I didn't have anyone to ride home with. One night after everyone made their way out and back home, I decided I was going to do 2 more runs and set off for home. I hit the trail and hauled ass all the way to the bottom and stopped dead on a flat run out at the end. Something primal took over. I had the feeling I was being watched. I whipped off my goggles and helmet and started to push up slowly, thinking I was being paranoid. I got the chills and started hearing sounds, footsteps in the dirt, slogging, bushes. I pushed up faster until I hit part of the trail that was separated by an island of trees. I stopped and the noises were close. I looked through the trees, and on the other side was a crazed-looking man, fairly dirty and dripping with sweat. He had a claw hammer in his hand and was looking around on the prowl. I suddenly felt paralyzed with pure terror. I picked up my bike so its wheels were off the ground, so he couldn't hear the freewheel ticking sound, and stood there, totally thinking I was about to die. I hear the same thing about 5 feet to my rear, and there is a bigger man of similar description, also with a hammer. I stand there, motionless in this 8ft wide island of trees for what felt like 10 minutes with my downhill bike in my skinny 12 years old arms. They passed up the trail and I have never moved so fast out of that place. My heart was pounding and I felt sick. I got onto the road into the small rural town I rode through on the way home and sat on a wall shaking. I got home and went to my room and never told anyone. Camping with some friends on the Northern Irish border. Solid night, a few drinks, nice fire, and we turned in late. After 20 minutes of settling down, the fire, which had been well and truly stamped out, starts back up. We can see the glow through the tent walls. Being lazy 15 years old, we don't go back out and sort it. Another few minutes pass and we hear some footsteps. One of us calls out, "Who is there?" No response. More footsteps. Twigs crack, and now as they pass close to the tent, whoever is out there brushes the tent wall. We call out again, no response. More footsteps. The number increases. They brush gently against the tent walls more and more. It sounds like 20 or 30 people walking around the tents as quietly as possible, wiping their hands on the tent walls, trying to freak us out. Needless to say, we are pretty terrified. After way too long paralyzed, I crawl out of the tent. Still a dark, moonless night with only the smoldering remains of the fire giving off a dull red glow. I see nothing. No one. Hours of broken, restless sleep and more of the same terrifying noises. The sun rises. We get out of our tents greeted by the sight of 50 or so sheep. Heavy winds had blown life back into our fire and blown down a section of fence, giving the sheep an escape from a nearby field to our clearing. In the end, I was just glad none of the sheep had caught fire. I used to work at a summer camp in the hill country. After the kids went to sleep, the counselors would go about screwing around and doing the usual stupid things that 18-24-year-olds do when minimally supervised and plenty of space to roam. One night, on a full moon, a group of us had taken one of the trucks out to a nearby field to smoke and drink. The field was surrounded by woods, filled with waist-high grass, and had a single road running down the middle of it. We stopped in the exact center of the field and were chilling for about 20 minutes when someone says, "Who is that?" It wasn't a "what" but a "who" question, which piqued my interest. I turned around, and at the entrance to the field where we had come from, there's this person just standing there. They were about 100 yards off and it was nighttime, clear with a full moon, so we couldn't make out much detail except that they were wearing light white clothes and were white. It was super weird. We called to them to come join us, but they just started pacing back and forth in front of the entrance to the field. This went on for a couple of minutes. Well, about 2/3 of the people in the truck bed of the truck were high and started to work themselves into a stoner's paranoia, so my buddy and I took over the cab and turned the truck around to put the high beams on whomever was over there at the edge of the woods. With the beams out, we could see them pacing back and forth. As soon as we flipped them on, it was just field and woods with road going off straight ahead. Turn the lights off and there the person is pacing back and forth. Lights on, person gone. Lights off. White figure clearly walking back and forth. The people in the back of the truck were losing their fucking minds at this point. I turned to my buddy in the driver's seat and said, "We have to drive through there to get to the camp." He just says, "Yup." I told everyone in the back to sit down and that we were heading back. One girl starts crying. 2 guys are pulling out pocket knives. Terrible idea since they're in the back of a bouncing pickup truck on a dirt road and stoned out of their minds. The last guy just grabs the side of the truck and looks terrified. We turned on the high beams and drove towards the entrance. No figure in sight. We pass into the woods along the road. No figure. Someone from the bed of the truck yells she's still there. After we passed through, we got back to the camp, hid the beer and weed, and never went back to that field again. When I told a sanitized version of that story to the campers, they laughed at me. I had never seen anything like that before or since, but I am now convinced I saw a ghost. I don't know what it was about, but I saw it. Edit, no bear, just beer. When I was a teenager, I worked nights part-time at the airport sorting packages for a major US carrier. I worked with my best friend, and since we both lived about 20 miles away from work, we'd carpool. He'd usually meet me at my house and we'd drive down to work. My house at the time was nestled in at the edge of a state forest heavily wooded area. One night we're coming back about 4 a.m. I park my car. We get out. Nothing unusual. Typical woodsy nighttime summer sounds. Crickets, some birds. All of a sudden we hear a blood-curdling scream like I've never heard before. A woman was definitely in distress or being raped or attacked or something in the woods not far from home. I run inside the house and probably give my parents a heart attack by shouting, "I need the shotgun." Dad jumps out of bed, and by this time he hears the screams as well. Nice cool night, windows open. We load up, grab flashlights, and 45 seconds later are out the back door, sprinting with my buddy towards the sounds. At the edge of the woods we stop and listen. Nothing. No screaming whatsoever. A minute goes by. We walk into the woods, shining our lights all over. Walking down the trails, shining lights up into the trees. But we hear nothing again. We call out. We hang around for an additional 15 minutes or so before heading back. It was the oddest, most scary thing that happened while living there. We get back to the house, and Mom had called the sheriff's office, who took our info down and said they'd send a car out. No one ever came that night, but later the next morning we did get a visit from an old deputy who took our report. The deputy listened, and then suggested it was likely a fox, big cat, bobcat, maybe even a mountain lion. I swear to this day it was a human female screaming for her life. But after searching the nearby woods during the day, we found nothing. No one was reported attacked or missing. A few weeks later, I'm home asleep at night, window open, and wake to my dachshund on my bed staring out the window, shaking uncontrollably. I look over, and there, framed perfectly by the light of the moon, was a large cat on its hind paws peering in the window. I jump out of bed, startling it, and it quietly jumps away. We never saw or heard anything after that. My family moved a few years later, so I guess the deputy was right. It probably was a big cat, but to this day those sounds still haunt me late at night when I'm out camping or spending time near the woods.